The tires of Alice's old pickup truck crunched against the gravel as she pulled up to the towering Victorian mansion. The late afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows over the structure, accentuating its decayed charm. Ivy crawled like skeletal fingers across the cracked facade, and the windows, dulled with age, reflected the light like hollow, watchful eyes. Alice stepped out, stretching her arms, her heart thrumming with a mix of excitement and unease. "This is it, Evan," she said, glancing back at her 10-year-old son, who sat silently in the back seat, clutching his favorite stuffed bear. He didn't respond, his wide eyes fixed on the looming house. The wind howled suddenly, sweeping dead leaves into a swirling dance at their feet. Alice shivered, brushing it off as the chill of autumn. She grabbed the keys from her bag and walked toward the heavy oak door, which seemed to groan in protest as she pushed it open. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The grand entryway stretched into darkness, the faded floral wallpaper peeling like dead skin. A chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals dusty and cobwebbed. Yet, despite the decay, Alice felt an odd pull, a sense that this house, with all its history, could be a fresh start. "It's bigger than it looked online," she said, forcing a cheerfulness that didn't quite match her surroundings. Evan followed hesitantly, his steps echoing eerily. "It smells weird," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Alice chuckled nervously. "It's just old, honey. We'll air it out, and it'll be perfect." She didn't tell him that the house had been a steal, almost suspiciously cheap for something of its size and location. Alice chalked it up to the rural setting and the small town's seeming indifference to its history. They explored room by room, each filled with an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their ears. Alice ran her fingers over a marble fireplace in the living room, admiring its craftsmanship. Evan lingered by a spiral staircase, peering upward as if drawn to something unseen. As evening fell, they brought in their belongings, setting up makeshift sleeping arrangements until the movers arrived. The first night felt heavy. The house creaked and groaned as the wind battered its walls. Alice dismissed it as the house settling, though the sound carried a strange cadence, almost like footsteps pacing above. Around midnight, Alice awoke to a scream so piercing it felt like it had torn the air itself. She bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it resonated through the house, as if the very walls were wailing. She rushed to Evan's makeshift bed on the floor, finding him wide awake, his face pale as the moonlight streaming through the window. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. It came from upstairs. Alice swallowed hard, staring at the ceiling. The house had gone eerily silent, but the faint echo of the scream lingered in her ears. "It's nothing," she lied, pulling Evan close, but as she held him, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Somewhere above them, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The morning sun filtered through the cracked curtains, painting strange patterns on the walls of Alice's room. She stirred awake, the events of the night before rushing back in vivid detail. The scream, it wasn't a nightmare. It had felt too real, but daylight had a way of dulling the edges of fear. Evan, however, wasn't convinced. He sat at the small breakfast table in the kitchen, stirring his cereal with little interest. His eyes were rimmed with shadows, his usual chatter replaced by an unsettling quiet. "You didn't sleep well?" Alice asked, trying to sound casual, though her own nerves were fraying. Evan looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "There was someone upstairs last night," he said flatly. Alice froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, sweetie? It was just the house. Old houses make weird noises." "No," his voice was firm, too firm for a 10-year-old. "I saw her." Her heart skipped a beat. "Saw who?" Evan hesitated, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "A lady. She was standing at the top of the stairs. She was crying." Alice set her spoon down, the metallic clang breaking the thick silence. "Evan, you must have been dreaming. You were tired." She was real," he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "She looked at me, Mom." She was sad, but angry too. Alice's pulse quickened, but she forced a smile. "Let's not jump to conclusions, okay? Maybe you just imagined it. This house is old, and everything feels new and strange." Evan didn't argue, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the small, sleepy town. Alice decided to take a break from the house, desperate to shake off the oppressive feeling that clung to her since their arrival. She left Evan playing in the yard with his soccer ball and walked toward the small general store down the road. The store was quaint and smelled of cedar and old books. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with piercing gray eyes and hair pulled tightly into a bun. She greeted Alice with a polite, if hesitant, smile. "You're the one who moved into the old Harrow house," the woman said, her tone more statement than question. Alice blinked, surprised. "Yes, that's right. It's a bit of a fixer-upper, but it has potential." The woman's smile faltered. "Fixer-upper? That's one way to put it." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "You'd do well to be careful in that house." Alice frowned, confusion mingling with a growing unease. "What do you mean?" Before the woman could respond, the shop's bell jingled as another customer entered. The conversation was cut short, but the woman's lingering gaze stayed with Alice as she paid for her groceries and left. When Alice returned to the house, she found an older man leaning on the gate, his weathered face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were worn but tidy, and his expression was one of cautious concern. "You're Alice, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice gravelly. She nodded, clutching the grocery bags tightly. "Can I help you?" He sighed and tipped his hat. "Name's Samuel. I live just up the road. Figured I'd stop by and introduce myself." "Nice to meet you," Alice said, though something in his demeanor set her on edge. Samuel glanced at the house, his jaw tightening. "You're brave, moving in there with a little one." Alice stiffened. "Why does everyone keep saying that? Is there something I should know about this house?" Samuel hesitated, his gaze flickering to the upstairs windows. "This place has a history. Folks around here call it Harrow House, after the family that used to live here. They say it's cursed, haunted by the sorrow of those who died here." Alice felt a chill creep down her spine. "Died here?" Samuel nodded solemnly. "The Harrows were a troubled lot. Tragedy followed them like a shadow. The last owner, a young woman, disappeared without a trace. Some say she still lingers." Alice forced a nervous laugh. "Come on, ghost stories? Isn't that a little cliché?" Samuel didn't smile. "I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you to be careful. This house doesn't like outsiders." Before Alice could respond, Samuel tipped his hat again and walked away, leaving her standing frozen at the gate. That evening, as the house settled into its nightly symphony of creaks and groans, Samuel's words replayed in Alice's mind. The unease in her chest grew heavier, and she found herself watching the shadows on the walls as if they might move. Evan, oblivious to the neighbor's warning, seemed preoccupied with the wooden box he'd found. He sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at it intently. "Evan, put that away and get ready for bed," Alice said, her voice sharper than she intended. Evan looked up, his expression distant. "She doesn't want me to." Alice froze. "Who doesn't want you to?" He blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. "No one." "Never mind." He tucked the box under his arm and headed upstairs. As Alice cleaned up the kitchen, a soft knock echoed from the front door. Her heart leapt. She hesitated before opening it, finding no one there. But on the porch lay a single, wilted rose. The night had fallen, thick and heavy with an oppressive silence that seemed to wrap itself around the house. Alice had never been a fan of the dark, but tonight, the shadows felt more sinister. The wind outside howled, scraping against the old wooden beams, but inside, everything was unnervingly still. Alice had just tucked Evan into bed, his small face pale from exhaustion. He hadn't been sleeping well, plagued by vivid dreams and strange whispers. She knew the stress of the move had been hard on him, but something about the way he spoke of the house unsettled her. As she stepped out of his room, she noticed the attic door at the end of the hall. It was the only door in the house that hadn't opened since they'd moved in. It stood at the top of the narrow staircase, its wood dark and scratched as if it had been unused for decades. She had passed it every day without a second thought, but tonight, it seemed to call to her. There was something about the way it stood there, silent and foreboding, that made her skin crawl. The thought of going up there crossed her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. Yet, her curiosity gnawed at her. The way an itch can't be ignored. Why hadn't she checked the attic? The house was full of secrets, and something about that door felt wrong. The unseen presence. Alice walked towards the staircase, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. The door stood at the top, dark and unreachable, as if daring her to come closer. Her breath came quicker with each step, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The air in the hallway felt different now, heavier, thicker. She hesitated at the foot of the stairs, glancing back at Evan's door. The faintest sound drifted from inside, something that sounded like a low, mournful sigh. She swallowed hard, the knot in her stomach tightening. Against her better judgment, Alice ascended the stairs. The closer she got to the door, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The old wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet, each step a reminder of the house's age and weight. At the top of the stairs, she stood before the attic door. The heavy silence surrounded her, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard something from the other side. A soft thump, like a door closing or perhaps something heavier. Her hand hovered above the doorknob, but she couldn't bring herself to turn it. Something in her gut told her that once she opened that door, there would be no going back. The moments seemed to stretch, each second hanging in the air like a fragile thread. But then, from inside the attic, came a whisper so soft that it was almost imperceptible. Alice. Her heart leapt into her throat. She knew that voice, had heard it before in her dreams, in the quiet moments when she thought she was alone. Before she could move, the door seemed to groan, its old hinges giving way. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from within, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing in the dark. Alice's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. She wanted to turn and run, but her legs refused to obey. The voice called again, this time louder, more urgent. Alice, come closer. It was too much. She couldn't stand it any longer. Her hand finally gripped the knob, twisting it slowly. The door creaked open with a sound that felt like the final warning of a coming storm. Inside the attic was a thick layer of dust, and the air was stifling. The light from the hallway barely penetrated the darkness beyond. Alice stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Her eyes scanned the room, but it was hard to make anything out. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move, a dark shape, shifting in the shadows. Alice's heart raced. She stepped back, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the room seemed to close in around her. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, the attic seemed to come alive. The walls, once still, pulsed with an unnatural energy, as if they were breathing. The faint sound of weeping filled the air, distant but unmistakable. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the house itself were alive, reacting to her presence. Alice's hands trembled as she fumbled for the door handle, but before she could escape, a shadow crossed her path, tall, indistinct, but undeniably there. The figure seemed to glide towards her, its presence oppressive and cold. As it neared, Alice could hear a voice, soft, desperate. Help me, Alice gasped, stumbling backwards into a pile of forgotten furniture. The figure loomed closer, and for the first time, Alice saw its face, a pale, gaunt woman, her eyes hollow and empty, her mouth moving soundlessly. A scream clawed at Alice's throat, but no sound came. The figure reached out, its hand cold as death itself, brushing against her arm. The attic door flew open, and Alice bolted down the stairs, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. She stumbled into the hallway, the lights flickering wildly as the air grew thick with dread. She reached Evan's room, slamming the door behind her, but the whispers, the cries, and the shadow followed her. She was not alone anymore. The house had claimed her. The days following Alice's encounter in the attic were shrouded in an unsettling fog of dread. She hadn't spoken much about what happened to Evan. How could she? The terror she'd felt in that cold, oppressive space seemed too unreal to share. And yet, the house itself refused to let her forget. Each night, as the house settled into its eerie rhythm of creaks and sighs, Alice couldn't shake the sensation that unseen eyes were watching her. The house felt alive, its presence pressing in from all directions. It wasn't just the shadows in the corners or the distant, echoing whispers anymore. It was as though the very walls had become sentient, feeding off her fear, tightening with every breath she took. She tried to maintain normalcy for Evan's sake. She cooked, cleaned, and smiled in the way a mother does, pretending that everything was fine. But the silence in the house was deafening. It was too quiet, too still, and the air itself seemed charged with a tension that made her skin crawl. One afternoon, while Evan played outside in the yard, Alice found herself alone in the living room. The flickering lights had become a constant nuisance, but today, the room felt colder than usual. She rubbed her arms, trying to stave off the creeping chill that seemed to crawl under her skin. As she moved toward the fireplace, something caught her eye, a shadow, just at the edge of her vision. She froze. It wasn't the usual shifting darkness. This was something different. The shadow seemed to pulse, shifting slowly as though it were alive. "Hello?" she called out nervously, though she was sure no one else was there. There was no answer, just the oppressive silence. Alice's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she thought she saw the shadow move again. but it was gone before she could blink. A cold breeze washed over her, and the hairs on her neck stood up. She quickly glanced around the room, her breath shallow, but it wasn't just the shadow. The air itself felt different, thick with something unseen. Alice had heard stories of houses with a life of their own, houses that grew hungry for the souls within, but she had never believed them. Now, standing in the middle of her own home, she wasn't so sure. That night, as the house groaned with the weight of its age, Alice lay in bed, unable to sleep. The walls seemed to whisper, faint voices that she couldn't quite make out. They weren't the voices of the past. They were something darker, more malicious. They drifted through the floorboards and rattled the windows, as though trying to break free of their unseen prison. Alice's thoughts swirled in panic. She remembered the stories that Samuel and the old woman in the shop had warned her about. The Harrow family's dark history, the vanishing of the last owner, the girl who had disappeared into the very walls of this house. Was that what these voices were? The trapped souls of those who had come before her, forever bound to the house by something ancient and unforgiving? Her body tensed as the voices grew louder, closer, and then nothing. A sudden, suffocating silence hung in the air. Alice's heart pounded in her chest as she strained her ears, waiting for the next sound. Then she heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like nails scraping across wood. Slowly, it grew louder, closer. Something was moving, something unseen, but unmistakably there. Suddenly, the bed shifted. Alice jolted upright, her heart racing. The mattress sank beneath her as if someone or something was crawling toward her. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, strangled by an invisible force. The room spun, the walls closing in around her. With a frantic surge of adrenaline, Alice pushed herself off the bed and scrambled for the door. But as she reached the handle, her hand froze. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and a low, guttural growl emanated from somewhere in the dark recesses of the house. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something alive. The growl turned into a screeching wail, and Alice felt a rush of cold air, like icy fingers, clutching at her. She fought against the invisible grip, her feet scrambling for purchase on the floor as she stumbled toward the hallway. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside the room. Alice spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there, nothing she could see. And yet, the air around her crackled with an unseen energy, heavy with malevolence. The force pushing against her chest grew unbearable, and Alice gasped for breath. She clawed at the door, her nails scraping against the wood, but it was no use. The unseen hand was too strong. Finally, with one last desperate scream, Alice felt the pressure lift, the house releasing her from its suffocating grip. The door flew open, and she bolted down the stairs, her heart racing, her mind reeling. But even as she ran through the hallways, she knew that the house was never going to let her go. Not now, not ever. Alice couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was taunting her. The whispers in the walls, the shadows that moved on their own, and the unseen force that had nearly suffocated her, none of it made sense. She needed answers. Desperately, she had to know what this house was hiding. Determined, Alice began scouring the house the following morning. Evan was safely at school, and she had the entire day to herself. She started in the attic, carefully avoiding the broken floorboard where she'd first sensed the oppressive presence. Dust filled the air as she dug through old trunks and boxes, uncovering remnants of the past, faded photographs of solemn faces, tattered letters written in elegant cursive, and one peculiar leather-bound journal. The journal's cover bore the name Margaret Harrow, etched deeply into the worn leather. Alice's hands trembled as she flipped open the book. The pages were filled with entries, each one more chilling than the last. The first few entries painted a picture of an ordinary family. Margaret Harrow wrote of her husband, Ed Ward, and their 3 children, 2 boys and a little girl named Clara. The Harrows had moved into the house decades ago, full of hope and promise. But as Alice continued reading, the tone of the entries shifted. Margaret began describing strange occurrences, furniture moving on its own, voices calling out to her children in the dead of night, and unexplainable cold spots throughout the house. One entry stood out in particular. It started with Clara. Margaret had written, her neat handwriting growing erratic. She spoke of a shadow that visited her at night, whispering secrets. At first, I dismissed it as a child's nightmare, but then Edward saw it too, a dark figure standing at the foot of our bed, watching us. Alice's pulse quickened as she read further. Margaret recounted how the family's once happy life descended into chaos. Edward grew distant, their 2 sons fell mysteriously ill, and Clara, sweet, Innocent Clara vanished without a trace. The journal abruptly ended with a final, desperate entry. It wants us. It won't stop until it has us all. God forgive me for what I must do. Alice slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking. The Harrow family hadn't just lived in this house, they'd been consumed by it. Armed with the chilling details from the journal, Alice decided to dig deeper. That afternoon, she visited the town library, hoping to uncover more about the Harrow family and the house itself. The librarian, a frail woman with sharp eyes, hesitated when Alice asked about the house. "You're living there?" the librarian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice nodded, her unease growing. The librarian sighed and retrieved a dusty file from the archives. Inside were old newspaper clippings detailing the Harrows' tragic fate. Edward was found hanging in the attic. The boys succumbed to their mysterious illness within weeks. Clara was never found. The house, it seemed, had a dark reputation long before the Harrows. There were accounts of previous owners going mad, children vanishing, and whispers of occult rituals performed on the land centuries ago. As Alice read through the records, a sinking realization dawned on her. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Whatever evil lingered there had been growing stronger with each generation, feeding off the fear and despair of its inhabitants. Her stomach churned as she thought of Evan, the shadow in the attic, the voices in the walls. It was coming for them, just as it had come for the Harrows. Alice snapped the file shut and hurried out of the library. She had to find a way to protect her son and escape the clutches of the malevolent force that had claimed so many lives before hers. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't let them go so easily. The house wasn't just a place, it was a predator. Alice couldn't escape the images that haunted her mind, the journal entries, the harrowing newspaper clippings, and the knowledge that the house had a dark history far older than she had imagined. But even worse than that, the house had begun to change her. The shadows that once seemed distant now pressed in close, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. The whispers, once faint, were now unmistakable, creeping through the walls, curling around her ears, muttering things she couldn't quite understand but that chilled her to her very core. Each night, the noises became louder, more distinct. At first, they were distant and sporadic, easy to ignore, but as the days went on, the whispers grew into something else, something far more sinister. The groaning of the house at night became a cacophony of unholy sounds, scratching, tapping, scurrying feet, and, worst of all, the screams. It was a night like any other when the screams began. Alice lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the oppressive quiet of the house smothering her. Evan had already gone to bed, and Alice had finally convinced herself to sleep. The stress, the terror, the sense of being hunted, it was all becoming too much. She tried to push the thoughts out of her head, but the fear gnawed at her. Then, from the floor below, the unmistakable sound of a scream shattered the silence. It wasn't the kind of scream that could be ignored. It was a shrill, gut-wrenching cry, a voice filled with terror and desperation. Alice's blood ran cold. It wasn't Evan, he was upstairs in his room, sound asleep. The scream continued, echoing through the house, rising in pitch, as if the very walls were alive with pain. Alice bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She tried to call out to Evan, but her throat was dry, the words choking on her tongue. The scream twisted into something darker, a horrible wail that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth itself. The walls rattled as if the house was shaking, its foundation groaning under an invisible weight. Alice didn't know if it was the sound of a person or something else, something far more monstrous, but whatever it was growing closer. Her legs felt heavy as Alice forced herself out of bed. The air around her thickened, every step seeming to weigh 100 pounds. She made her way down the dark hallway, the scream still echoing in her mind. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off her fear, driving her toward the inevitable. "Evan!" she shouted, her voice trembling. She reached his door, her hand shaking as she grasped the knob, but before she could open it, the scream stopped. Dead silence. Alice's breath hitched, her heart pounding louder than ever. She pushed the door open, the room illuminated only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Evan was asleep, blissfully unaware of the terror that had just gripped the house. He lay still, his breathing steady, his face calm, but as Alice stepped further into the room, something caught her eye. The shadows. They had grown, stretching across the walls in unnatural ways, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. Alice's breath caught in her throat as she backed away from them, her back slamming into the doorframe. A cold breeze rushed through the room, and the whispers began again, louder than ever. Alice spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. Nothing was there. The house itself was alive with the sounds of its haunting, and Alice realized with a terrible certainty that the house was never going to let them leave. For the next several days, the house became a prison, its unseen forces pushing Alice to the brink of madness. The screams didn't stop. At night, they would come from all corners of the house, each scream more chilling than the last. It felt like the walls themselves were screaming in agony. The shadows grew longer, more insistent, and the whispering voices became clearer, taunting her with promises of the horrors that awaited her. Alice spent her nights pacing the house, trying to make sense of the madness. Was it the house itself? Was it trying to drive her insane, just like it had done to the Harrow family? Or was it something else, something far worse, that had taken root in this place? The pressure was unbearable. Every corner she turned, every creaking floorboard, every flicker of light held the promise of something lurking just beyond her reach. The house had become a monster, a malevolent force that grew stronger the longer they stayed. And it wasn't finished yet. The air in the house had grown heavy, thick with a suffocating tension that made it almost impossible to breathe. It was as if the very walls were pressing in, eager to close around Alice and her son, to trap them in the nightmare that had begun the moment they set foot inside. The whispers were now constant, never leaving her side, sometimes a low murmur, other times a frantic, breathless voice just behind her, begging her to listen, to understand. But the words were always elusive, like a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. It was one particularly cold night when it happened. The house had been eerily silent for a few hours, the darkness outside pressing in on the windows like the eyes of some unseen observer. Alice had hoped for a moment of respite, a fleeting break from the chaos that had consumed their lives. But the silence, the kind that almost felt wrong in its stillness, was shattered by a sound that froze her to the core. A door creaked open downstairs. Her heart thudded violently against her ribs as she stood motionless, listening. The house was still and quiet again, but the door had definitely moved. She knew that Evan had been sound asleep upstairs. There was no way it was him. The house felt alive in a way it never had before, as if it were watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Trembling, Alice slowly made her way down the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. Her footsteps echoed like a drumbeat, each one a reminder that she was not alone in the house. Not anymore. The door was ajar just a crack when she reached the bottom of the stairs. She hesitated, her pulse quickening, the hairs on the back of her neck standing at attention. The whispering had started again, a chorus of faint, unintelligible voices coming from within the room. "Who's there?" Alice called out, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. No answer. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she pushed the door open wider, her hand shaking as it touched the cold metal knob. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Her eyes scanned the room, the eerie silence pressing in on her like a heavy weight. And then, she saw it. In the far corner of the room, a shadow stood, darker than the rest of the room around it, as if it was made of the very darkness itself. It was not a man, nor a woman, but a shape, a form that seemed to warp and twist as Alice stared at it, too horrific to be real yet too vivid to be dismissed as a trick of the mind. The air around it was colder, the shadows more pronounced, and Alice could feel the pressure of its gaze, even though it did not have eyes. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were screaming in terror. Alice's breath caught in her throat as the figure moved, taking one slow, deliberate step toward her. Its presence seemed to distort the very space around it, bending the air with its malevolent force. Leave this place." The voice came, not from the figure itself, but from all around her, surrounding her with an unnatural resonance. It was a voice that sent shivers down her spine, a voice that held no warmth, no humanity, only cold malice. Alice stumbled backward, her feet unsteady on the cold, uneven floor. The figure did not move closer, but the oppressive presence of its power was overwhelming, suffocating her. It didn't need to touch her, it was already inside her mind, a dark stain that was slowly consuming her thoughts. With a cry, Alice snapped herself from the trance-like state that had begun to envelop her. She slammed the door shut with a force that shook the walls, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. For a moment, the house was silent again, but the air was different now, heavier, darker, as if the very structure of the house had shifted. Evan's voice broke the silence from upstairs. "Mom, what's wrong?" Alice rushed to his room, barely able to keep her breath steady. She opened the door, looking at her son with wide, terrified eyes. we need to leave. Now. But she knew, deep down, that it wasn't that simple. The house had marked them. It was coming for them. And this was only the beginning. The house, once a strange but quiet refuge, had transformed. It was no longer just a place where Alice and Evan lived, it was something far more sinister, an entity in itself, with a consciousness that was darker than anything Alice had ever imagined. It had begun to twist the very fabric of reality, shifting the air around them, manipulating time, and turning their lives into a living nightmare. Every room felt different now, suffused with an overwhelming malevolence. The once familiar walls now seemed to close in, bending under the weight of unseen eyes that followed Alice's every movement. The floorboards creaked in patterns that felt deliberate, as though someone or something was lurking just out of sight. One night, as Alice sat in the living room, her mind racing with the events that had already unfolded, she felt it again, the cold, heavy presence that had settled in the house. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, but now they weren't just in her head, they were in the air, in the walls, in the very foundation of the house itself. Her body felt heavy, as though the house was pressing against her from every angle, urging her to give in. She could no longer tell where the house ended and where she began. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, breathing with an unnatural rhythm, and as her eyes scanned the room, they were drawn to the shadows that seemed to move on their own, creeping along the corners, slithering like tendrils, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Evan," she whispered hoarsely, panic gripping her chest, but when she turned, she realized he was no longer in the room. He had been there moments ago, but now he was gone. Her heart skipped a beat. She rushed through the house, her feet stumbling over the cold, hard floors. The whispers grew louder with every step, echoing off the walls as if they were mocking her, encouraging her descent into madness. "Evan," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. The house seemed to mock her as she passed through rooms, each one darker than the last, each corner more twisted and foreign. The hallways seemed endless now, looping in ways that defied logic. As she reached Evan's room, the door was ajar. She rushed inside, and her heart stopped. There, standing in the center of the room, was Evan, but it wasn't her son. Not anymore. The figure before her was distorted, its features grotesque and elongated. His eyes were wide, white, and unblinking, staring into nothingness, like empty sockets devoid of life. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream, the air around him thick with the overwhelming sense of dread. "Evan?" Alice choked out, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, a hollow shell. Suddenly, the air turned ice cold. Alice felt a sharp, searing pain in her chest, like something was tearing at her from the inside. She staggered backward, her vision blurring. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each one louder than the last. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were shouts, commands, demands. The house itself was speaking to her now, speaking through her son's body, forcing its will upon her. "Leave, leave now, or it will consume you both." The voice was no longer human, no longer a whisper. It was deep, guttural, echoing through the house, shaking her to the core. The very walls seemed to pulse with the voice, as if the house was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every second. Alice tried to move, tried to reach for Evan, but her body refused to obey. She felt trapped, helpless, as the house tightened its grip on her, pulling her deeper into its dark web. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, swirling around her, pressing in on her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. All she could do was watch, paralyzed, as the house took control, controlling her body, her mind, and the very soul of her son. The walls groaned under the strain, and she could hear the floorboards creak in time with the unholy rhythm of the house's malevolent heartbeat. And then, the voice spoke again, clearer now, as if it was right beside her, inside her mind. "You belong to me now." The house had won. It had claimed them, body and soul. Alice was no longer in control. It was no longer a fight for survival. The house had become the master, and they were nothing more than its puppets. In the darkness of that room, the finality of it all hit her. She had come too far to escape, and now, there was no way out. Alice's mind was fracturing, pieces of reality slipping through her grasp like sand in the wind. The house had taken root deep inside her soul, and the more she fought, the more the darkness seemed to consume her. It wasn't just the walls anymore. The house itself was alive, pulsing, breathing, and suffocating her from every corner. After that horrifying encounter with Evan, no, the twisted version of him, Alice could no longer trust her own senses. The house was warping her perception of everything. The shadows didn't just move, they watched. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were commands, pleas, and threats all at once. But there was one thing Alice couldn't shake, the feeling that the house was leading her somewhere, a place she was not ready to face. It was in the dead of night, when the house was at its quietest, that Alice stumbled upon the door. It had always been there, at the far end of the hallway, hidden behind a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. She had passed it 1,000 times, unaware of what lay beyond. But tonight, something was different. The door seemed to call to her, beckoning her closer, urging her to open it. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle, the chill in the air wrapping around her like a cold embrace. With a reluctant breath, she turned the knob, the sound of the door creaking open sending a shiver down her spine. The room beyond was bathed in an unnatural, dim light, and the air felt thick with dread, thick with something far worse than she could comprehend. As she stepped inside, her heart pounded against her chest, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pulse of the house itself. The room was small, its walls covered in strange symbols and markings, drawn with a substance that could only be blood. The floor was littered with remnants of broken candles, old and melted. But what truly caught her attention was the center of the room. A large, stone altar stood there, dark and ancient, covered in dust and age. The very air around it seemed to vibrate with a dark energy that made Alice's skin crawl. But there was something more, something she couldn't explain. On the altar were objects, ceremonial in nature, placed with a precision that made her stomach turn. The more she looked, the more the room seemed to pulsate with an oppressive force, like a beating heart, pulling her deeper into its grip. And then she saw it, a journal, its pages yellowed with age, resting beside a ceremonial knife, its blade long, curved, and glinting ominously in the dim light. Alice hesitated, but a strange compulsion overtook her. She reached for the journal, her fingers trembling, as if the house itself was pushing her to learn its secrets. As she opened the journal, her eyes scanned the pages, each one filled with cryptic text and disturbing illustrations, drawings of the house, of people in strange, twisted poses, of dark rituals being performed under a full moon. And then, the truth hit her like a punch to the gut. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, a vessel, a place where rituals were performed to summon something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The house was alive, yes, but it was more than that. It was a gateway, a conduit for something ancient, something evil, something that had been bound here long ago, and now, it was trying to break free. Alice's breath quickened, her heart racing. The symbols on the walls were part of the ritual, part of the plan to summon the entity that had been trapped here. The altar was a sacrifice, a way to feed the house, to make it stronger, to bring it closer to the living world. The house was controlling everything, her, Evan, the very air she breathed. The walls seemed to close in on her as the journal slipped from her hands, its pages fluttering wildly in the eerie silence of the room. But before she could react, she heard it. The whispers, they were louder now, surrounding her from all sides, growing in intensity. "You are not alone here," the voice echoed, deep and hollow, as if coming from within the very walls of the house. "You are part of the ritual now. There is no turning back." The air grew colder, the shadows thickening around her. Alice stumbled backward, her mind racing for any way out, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She was trapped, in the heart of the house, at the center of its darkness, surrounded by its power. The ritual had begun, and there was no escaping its grasp. The walls of the house seemed to breathe around Alice, their pulse matching the erratic beat of her own heart. With every passing moment, the grip of terror tightened. The air was suffocating, thick with the weight of dark secrets, suffused with the remnants of long-forgotten rituals. The ritual room, now a place of deep unease, had left Alice shaken to her core. She had learned too much, far too much, and the house had sensed it. As she staggered back from the altar, still reeling from the horrifying knowledge she had uncovered, a strange feeling took hold of her. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the unmistakable sense of being watched, of being hunted. The house, it seemed, had turned its gaze on her. It had always been watching, but now, the eyes of the house felt focused, predatory, and closing in. Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse than the spirits of the dead was lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to make a single misstep. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were in her mind. Every time she tried to push them away, they only grew louder, more insistent. The The voice that had echoed in the ritual room, the one that had told her she was part of the house now, was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a demand, a warning she could not ignore. Her mind was unraveling, slipping through the cracks of sanity with every passing second. Alice had to get out, she had to leave this place before it consumed her completely, but the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard she pulled at the handle, it remained stubbornly locked, as though the house itself was holding her prisoner. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped, her only option to venture further into the suffocating dark. And that's when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, where shadows twisted and merged like living things, she saw a figure, tall, cloaked in blackness, its face hidden in the dark recesses of its hood. The figure stood motionless, but Alice could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. Her heart leapt in her chest as a chill swept over her, colder than anything the house had ever made her feel. The figure didn't speak, it didn't need to. Its presence alone conveyed everything Alice needed to know. The house was sending her a message, and this figure was its messenger. She felt the weight of its warning sink deep into her bones, a sensation far worse than any physical pain. Alice took a step back, trembling. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she was rooted to the spot, as if the house itself had anchored her there, made her its unwilling guest. "You should have left when you had the chance." The figure's voice finally broke the silence, a voice like ice scraping over stone. The sound was unnatural, coming from the figure yet somehow echoing from the walls themselves. "The house is hungry, and it feeds on the weak." Alice's breath hitched in her throat, her stomach churning with dread. She knew what it meant. The house had claimed her. There was no escape now. The ritual had already begun, and the entity it sought to summon was closing in. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. "You are part of it now," the figure continued, its voice a venomous whisper. "Your fate is sealed, and there is no turning back. The house will take you." Alice's mind raced, scrambling for any sense of clarity. But the terror, the sense of being trapped, was overwhelming. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and she could barely breathe. The darkness in the house pressed in on her, suffocating, cold, and merciless. "Leave, while you can," the figure warned again, its voice fading as it receded back into the shadows, "before the house consumes you completely." But the words were too late. The house had already taken hold of her. The whispers in her mind were louder now, drowning out everything else. Her world blurred, twisted, and distorted. She was no longer in control. The house had claimed its next victim. Alice was no longer just a witness to its horrors, she was its next offering, its final sacrifice. And there was nothing, no one, that could save her now. The house had taken Alice, but it wasn't finished yet. Its hunger had only just begun to grow, an insatiable craving for more. The dark energy that had seized her was now shifting its focus towards Evan. He had always been the skeptic, the one who brushed off the strange occurrences in the house as figments of an overactive imagination. But now, even his ironclad disbelief couldn't shield him from the growing terror that was starting to pulse within the walls. Evan had been struggling to cope with the horrifying discoveries Alice had uncovered. She had changed, her eyes hollow, her movements erratic, as if the house had hollowed her out from within. But it wasn't Alice that terrified Evan now, it was the shift in her. Her voice, once familiar and warm, had grown cold and distant. The thing that spoke through her no longer resembled his wife. It was something else entirely, something older, darker, more insidious. And now, Evan could feel the same creeping dread starting to coil around him. One night, after another restless hour of searching for answers, Evan heard a whisper from the dark corners of the house. He froze. It wasn't the usual murmurs, the ones he could dismiss as his mind playing tricks. This voice was different, it was deep, guttural, and dripping with malice. It sounded almost familiar. "Evan," the voice crooned, and Evan's blood ran cold. His name, spoken like a threat, echoed down the hallway. It was as though the house had become alive, feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. Shaken, Evan made his way to the living room, where he saw Alice sitting motionless in the corner. Her back was to him, her body unnaturally still. He called her name softly, cautiously, but she didn't respond. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the house itself, as if it were watching him, waiting. A chill ran through him as the silence stretched, growing thicker. It felt like the walls were closing in. And then, just as he was about to turn away, Alice's voice rang out. But it was not the voice he knew. It was the voice from his nightmares, the voice that had whispered to him in the dark. Evan, it purred, each syllable dripping with an unnatural hunger. He stepped back, his mind reeling. Alice's head twisted unnaturally to face him, her eyes blackened, pools of void staring into his very soul. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile, it was something twisted, something that only existed in his darkest fears. You've been chosen, Evan, the voice hissed. The house will claim you. Just as it claimed her, Evan stumbled backward, his heart racing. He had known, deep down, that there was something wrong with this place, but he had refused to see it. Now, there was no denying it. The house had already begun to consume Alice, and it was coming for him next. Suddenly, Alice lunged toward him with a strength far beyond her own, her hands gripping his throat with unnatural force. His vision blurred as he struggled to break free, but the pressure on his neck only tightened. The voice, now distorted and overlapping with Alice's own, cackled from within her. You can't escape, it taunted. You never could. Evan's breath caught in his throat as the world around him spun out of control. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its power drawing him in, suffocating him with its malevolent energy. He could feel the darkness seeping into his very being, the cold fingers of possession wrapping around his soul. In a final, desperate act, Evan wrenched himself free from Alice's grasp, his body slamming into the wall as he gasped for air. His mind was spinning, but one thought clung to him.